Can you share some of the maybe daily habits or the rituals that you kind of, employed in order to kind of make sure that, you were successful in your career?
Sure. It's interesting because you don't realize growing up that your value system
Mm.
and the habits that you've learned in your home
Uh-huh.
have a real impact in the workplace. So this whole notion of a very strong work ethic that was instilled in me at a very young age. I started
Mhm.
working at a very young age when my mother became ill. And so it was all about doing with what you have,
Mhm.
um, understanding that there's opportunity in anything you do, even though you may have many constraints wrapped around that,
Mhm.
and that you can ultimately change the path. And so that instilled in me that regardless of what the circumstances were, I could make my mark if I worked really hard
Mhm.
and I drove for excellence. My mother always said, how do you operate? What's the quality of your work when no one's watching?
Oh,
You know,
right.
there was a kitchen in the home in anything we did. And so that instilled a sense of responsibility in terms of quality.
Mhm.
And I always said, when I moved to New York after graduate school, I was breaking into financial services for the first time. I didn't
Mhm.
have the experience nor the background on my resume. And yet that's what I brought to the table. And so as I met with folks, I always said, I've worked in sales, I've worked in real estate, but those are transferable skills. And what you will get from me, regardless of what anybody else you have on the team is, I have an incredibly strong work ethic. I'm creative, I'm innovative, and I
Mm.
will bring others to the table to solve issues. And in a global market where we work, bringing the right people to the table to get those ideas is a unique skill set. And so I drew from that strength. I drew from what I learned at home in terms of leveraging your network. My mother relied on many people for help
Mhm.
and using that to really create and showcase very strong results. I've always been very results oriented,
Mhm.
and that's really helped me make my mark.
And you talked about, I mean, that sounds like it was key, right? Building your kind of personal brand or being able to tell your story of that was your personal brand, that was the unique value proposition that you brought. How did you, break it down? Like if someone is saying, how do I articulate that to somebody? How did you kind of, draw on those values and that work ethic to be able to then tell that story to somebody?
And the telling of the story, as a Latina, is something that when I started my career, I struggled with. I have to, I was very concerned is the
Yeah.
word when I started, working in financial services about how much could I share, how much should I share, and was that going to help me or hurt me? And so I was very reserved in terms of early on in my career, the way I engaged, and it was all about work. And what
Right.
I've learned is the more you integrate your personal life with the workplace,
Hmm.
and the more you share what drives you, the more connectivity you have with those around you. And once you build a meaningful connection, then you can accomplish so much more. And that's how you build the relationships, which ultimately leads to sponsorship, which also
Hmm.
ultimately leads to opportunities. And so, what I learned, over 10 years ago is sharing your story brings others along. So
Mm.
that's number one, talking to others about your struggles, how you started, how you got to where you are, especially as I've had the opportunity to create teams
Hmm.
and hire talent around many of what I call startup efforts that I've been part of.
Hmm.
That's allowed me to bring new people together. And so creating that vision and talking to the teams that I've had the opportunity to lead from a more personal level and
Hmm.
be more vulnerable in terms of who I am and the fabric of what makes up Ileana Musa as a
Hmm.
leader
Right.
really allows folks to connect with me. And so starting a meeting with a personal story,
Hmm.
talking about the struggle in terms of managing, the the older parents with a young daughter and being sandwiched, and the pressure of being a working mom and
Hmm.
an executive, and all of these dimensions that make me up as an individual, and
Right.
having the courage to share that openly does a couple of things. It helps others share.
Hmm.
Others are watching. It's not just what you're saying but what you're doing, and so you're creating an environment that's more conducive for those that you're leading to feel that they have an open
Right.
environment who can
Mhm.
share, where they can integrate their life commitments and the job requirements and do it in a way that's balanced and in a way that's supported. And so I always say, it's not just what we're doing for ourselves, but others are watching, and
Mhm.
we're creating an environment that ultimately impacts many more people
Mhm.
and allows more flexibility. And ultimately, then that has positive intent as it relates to creating more opportunity. So sharing your story in very real terms
Mhm.
in your interactions with your colleagues and those in your network is very, very impactful. So that's, I would say, number one in terms of something that's really made a difference. Number two is sharing your vision.
Mm.
I always talk about, one of the things I learned at a young age is I saw a single mom ask a lot of people for a lot of help.
Right.
And that takes a lot of courage, especially when you don't know. And my mom used to always say, el no ya lo tienes.
Mm.
You've got a 50% shot at getting a yes if you lean in and ask. So go for it. And
Right.
so I made it a point to really reach out and be open, knowing that potentially the answer could be no, but whether it was reaching out about a connection, reaching out to learn something, reaching
Mhm.
out to ask for resources. And part of that outreach was also articulating my vision for the future.
Mm.
And so I always say, when you're thinking about your performance review,
Mhm.
how much time are you allocating to talk career, to talk aspiration, to talk vision? It's up to each of us to carve out, even if it's 5 minutes, 2 minutes, to
Right.
paint that picture of what the future holds. Because every time you have those connections and you're painting a picture for where you know the opportunities are, where you could lend your talent, people remember. And
Mhm.
so I always say, three roles in a role over 5 years for me was as a result of those outreaches.
Right.
My letting people know I remember one of the firms where I worked, we really didn't have an international presence
Mm.
within my division, but I would still talk about it. If I do, I want to lend my talent. I have the experience that I gained at another firm. And sure enough, through an acquisition, we started going global. And
Mm.
there I was being tapped for that opportunity because I talked, because I shared my vision. So
Right.
that's the other practice that I would say is very helpful
Mhm.
in terms of number one, making sure your direct manager and then your network and
Mhm.
stakeholders understand how you can lend your broader talent. Because in many organizations, folks view you for what you're doing today,
Right.
right?
Right.
We naturally evaluate opportunities based on what we observe individuals contributing today. So sharing your vision, really, really important. And then the two others, number one, build a strong track record. I've always said before you can aim higher and
Mhm.
reach for the stars, you need to show you can deliver. And so I've always been very focused on knowing the facts about the business, being
Mhm.
technically um, proficient in the
Mhm.
roles that I've had, whether it's understanding the financials, understanding the way you generate revenue or income, but becoming an expert in the business so that when you have a seat at the table, you
Mhm.
can create value and provide insights in a way that's very meaningful and that you're differentiating yourself.
Right.
So, but it starts from building that track record and delivering results. And then the final thing is, if you're authentic in the relationships you build,
Mm.
you really do get great sponsors that
Mm.
advocate for you, that are willing to put their reputations on the line to endorse you and to support you because you've shown you have a track record, you deliver
Mhm.
results, and you approach the relationship from one where you give versus get. And that's
Mhm.
where, influence comes in.
How did you kind of just make it past and overcome any of those failures or limiting beliefs or those types of fears that hold a lot of women back?
Yes, it's sometimes we get in our own way, as I like to say.
Yes.
And again, I was fortunate because my mother was a risk taker on so many fronts. Whether it was asking, engaging. She was an entrepreneur at heart. She started businesses while she worked multiple jobs, and so this was somebody that was very comfortable with trying new things. And she went for 10, knowing that two would stick,
Mhm.
and one she'd pull through, and she'd never look back. And
Mm.
so I think that's the DNA, the muscle memory you're trying to build as you go through your career, which
Mhm.
is we're all going to face failure. And I wouldn't call it failure, I would say setbacks, right?
Yes. Mhm.
It's bumps on the road, and being able to get bruised is sort of like, I have a young daughter, and I know there's huge benefit in going to the park and the playground and getting bruised up,
Right.
like there's something real about that exercise in the
Mhm.
playground that helps your children build character, helps them
Mhm.
engage with other children, pick themselves back up. And I think it's the same in the workplace. It's understanding that, number one, we don't have to be 100% ready.
Mm.
I've known, and the research shows it, especially as it relates to women, we overanalyze our
Yes.
ready in terms of an assignment, and that doesn't serve us well. And so I again, sharing my vision, I will raise my hand and go for an assignment where I don't have all the answers. And then I
Mm.
say I don't have all the answers, and I fill in those gaps as I go. But knowing that you have the opportunity to create value
Mhm.
while you're solving for things that you still have to learn and grow is the way it should be. And
Mhm.
so this whole notion of risk taking, which is understanding where if you're 60% of the way there, 70% of the way there, go for it.
Right.
Um, that's the first thing. Number two, um, when you have the setback, and I didn't do this early on in my career, but I've learned it.
Mm.
Acknowledge it, hit it head on, face it, say it, and to the extent it's had an impact on others, acknowledge it very openly, and then you can focus on how do you course correct and
Mhm.
recover. Because if not, sometimes we dwell.
Right.
Uh, that doesn't serve us well either. And sometimes we miss the mark in communicating. So we need to communicate. I've learned any changes that you need to make in any strategy, and there's plenty of them,
Mhm.
especially in new business, new model. You need to just come to terms with it, understand that you've learned from it, acknowledge it with your stakeholders, over communicate, and then move. It's time
Mhm.
to move on and take action. And so I'm very action oriented. I always want to keep moving forward, and that's helped me. But what
Mm.
I would say is these are some best practices, but there's
Mhm.
real emotion when there's a setback.
Yes.
And you go home and you think, am I going to be able to get through tomorrow after the day I've had today?
Mm.
And it's tough. And I always say we don't nearly talk enough about the struggles as we should, because we look at the resumes, we look at the bios, we look at the accolades, but behind all of that, there's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of bruises. There's a lot of, you
Right.
know,
Battle
impact
scars.
that's helped us grow. And so we need to talk about that, because that has to be part of the equation. And the
Mhm.
reason that's important is too often we throw in the towel. And
Mm.
I always say, I will never throw in the towel because of a setback. If you decide to make a change in terms of an assignment or role,
Mhm.
it should be on your own terms, because you're ready to do something bigger and
Right.
greater, not because you've had a setback that um, you think should set you back in terms of your career and
Mhm.
have you go in a different direction. That's never going to serve you well. So having a mindset, I think you really need to develop these skills and hone them over time. And so, you know, the the sooner you fail in terms of these setbacks at work,
Mhm.
the sooner you're going to learn. So it's actually a good thing to have those opportunities where you're going to take a risk, you're going to grow, and you're going to make some mistakes along the way.
What's your advice to women on how they can accelerate their success and stay ahead of the curve with all the change? Like, how do you stay ahead?
Couple of things, and it's fast. It's the pace is just ever evolving. So a couple of things, and going back to rituals, which you asked about, which
Mhm.
is, how are you allocating the time to focus on yourself? Really important in terms of staying ahead, because
Mhm.
we just talked about people being, your biggest asset, and
Mhm.
we are each our biggest asset. So we need to really take care of ourselves in
Mhm.
terms of, staying healthy and exercising, and just making sure you've got those boundaries to
Mhm.
focus on you, because that's what allows you to come to work every day and bring your A game,
Mhm.
which I find is really important. Number two, reading. I find that, I learned that many, many years ago when I started in my field.
Mhm.
access to so much information to understand what's the latest that's happening. And
Mhm.
so having sources that you focus on reading to stay apprised of what's happening in the marketplace, what's coming,
Mhm.
etc. The other one is connecting with the next gen. I think you and I were talking about it,
Yes.
but if you want to know what the future holds, stay connected with, who's coming next in terms of the way they think, the way they work, because that's really important in terms of staying relevant.
Yes.
And I really enjoy doing that because sometimes, as we all read about, there are real differences
Mhm.
in the next gen and the way they think, and there's real value in understanding the why and
Mhm.
then putting that to work.